Today we have the great privilege, not to put any pressure on her, of having Jennifer Kelly join us from Fenwick and West in San Francisco, where she is a partner in the litigation department. And I will not steal her thunder by telling you the cases she's worked on, but they will fascinate you, and you will find that she is always on the right side of the issues, right?
Absolutely.
So Jennifer, broadly speaking, is going to talk about what's original in a game and what isn't, and how to tell the difference. And like a Sherpa guide, I hope, I will get you part of the way up the mountain so that Jennifer can scale the peak with you. So the first, I'm going to try and keep this to 50 minutes. Anybody want to take bets on that? I really want to give you as much time with Jennifer as possible. What I'm going to try and do is talk about the issues. How do we get from where we were to questions of originality? And last week left you with a bit of a cliffhanger. It was sort of the culmination of what we were talking about in terms of the nature of connectivity in games, but want to start by elaborating on that and that model, and suggesting that as we look to what the laws are going to be in the future and what they need to be, we should keep in mind this specific model of how gaming is changing. Because if you don't want to make mistakes in how we formulate laws and how we change laws to accommodate the digital future, one way of doing that is to create a test case that seems more likely, yet in its own way is kind of out there, but is happening, and then apply the laws to that and apply the legal frameworks to that instead of just to what we have. So you'll remember this, or a version of this slide from last week, and this is where we ended. And the basic notion was that up to now, our games, we've sort of amassed, we live in reality, and our games and our computer boxes and our game boxes are influenced by reality and create a version of reality in the box, in the TV set, in the screen. And the emerging paradigm of like where games seem to be headed is the opposite, bringing gaming into reality and bridging out the other way, where the real world becomes the game. So I know you've long since accepted this about me, but it's always going to be a car racing game model. So Formula One in the real world becomes Grand Prix Legends in the digital world. And Grand Prix Legends, not to bore you with it, was the first sim that had a four-wheel physics model. In other words, the car model didn't pivot on its center axis, because cars don't drive by pivoting on their center axis, as you know. They drive based on their four wheels. So the innovation in Grand Prix Legends was Dave Kamer came up with a physics model that modeled the four wheels, and the cars turned on the four wheels, not on the center point of the mass, the theoretical mass of the car. But that's what I'm suggesting is the present model. And the present model, I mean, remember what we talked about in terms of medians at the beginning of the year. It's not like the present model is going to disappear. It's just something else is going to overtake it. So there will probably always be games like this. And you're basically reformatting the real world into the digital world. And now, the future model appears to be where you real world the game. And ingress is the example. And there's an article here which you can read, but it's the quote that's important. And this is from one of the developers, describing ingress as something like World of Warcraft, where everyone in the world is playing the same game. And that is quite literally everyone in the real world. So from there we go to, is this the new video game? And this is the hypothetical, a little bit more fleshed out than last week, but essentially the same thing. Real world play, ingress has got to capture the flag mechanic, an immersive control mechanism. I mean, this is Tyler's original point, but what's the control mechanism? Well, with ingress, you can see how Google Glass becomes the control mechanism. Connectivity anywhere and everywhere, courtesy of the cloud. Open world design, well, nothing can be a more open world design than the real world. So that sort of comes with it. And courtesy of string theory, we may even find we have alternate dimensions to play with eventually. Probably not in our lifetime. And then I think this is where it gets interesting and where it might be a bit of a playground for a while, but it'll get shut down eventually, is we start redefining tools and weapons in a game. Because once you're playing in the real world, we already have, AR drone copters. These are real things that you can control with your iPhone, and have cameras on them. And so suddenly you can feed all of that into a game like Ingress and into your Google Glass control mechanism, and you can have real wars with real things. Not sure the neighbors are going to approve. They're certainly not going to approve for long. Which brings us squarely to legal consequences. And it's not hard to suggest that as games move into the real world legal consequences become far more likely. Okay, anybody want to push back up to this point? Anybody see any alternate ways of looking at this? Okay, I know, you just want me to be done so we can get to Jennifer. I agree. But if we say that legal consequences are more likely, then a couple of fairly hallowed concepts to do with gaming get called into question. And we maybe need to reformat those. Or maybe they've been reformatted for us, and we'll get into that shortly. The first concept, talk much more about it in a minute, is the notion of the magic circle. Anybody know what magic circle is?
Yeah, You're not talking about the name for the top UK law firms, are you?
No, I'm not talking about the name for the top UK law firms, but spoken as a true law student.
It is, I believe they call them the Magic Circle, which is just weird.
They do. I'm going to take you back to a magic circle that I think predates that and was formulated before, in fact, before a video game. And the magic circle talks about the world within a world. And I'll give you a definition. But the basic notion is that when you have a world within a world, it might have and need and deserve its own set of rules and protocols. So the notion of a magic circle, a protected place, gets called into question when you move video gaming into the real world, obviously. Also, the larger theme of this class, well, what's original when you move your gaming experience into the real world? I mean, the real world, without getting too existential about it and too philosophical about it, exists already. It exists ready-made. So if you're building gaming into the real world, a number of notions, hallowed notions around originality and what's an object, how do you apply copyright, start becoming more challenging problems. What happens to already existing copyrights and trademarks? And if Ingress has a capture the flag mechanic at the local McDonald's, how does that play out? And what happens when you're with your Google Glass and you're 24/7, well, maybe not 24/7, but 12/24, videotaping everything that you're seeing and everything that you're playing, and that includes logos because you're playing in the real world, and all that's getting uploaded to the cloud. Mikhail.
Just wondering, like, if external rules are imposed on the virtual world and in this magic circle, how could that be reconciled with the end user license agreements and the terms of use that those are imposed on as well?
You have identified the missing link, and in the course of the next 15 minutes, I hope to give you at least a suggestion of the answer. But that's very much what we're really going to be talking about is, okay, the magic circle and then the layers, which include the contractual layer. And then what about external laws? How do these things permeate or not permeate? So that is your question as to how do you reconcile the magic circle with terms of use and EULAs and with real world laws is the rest of my time today. And then if you just really want to drive yourself over the edge, start in this real world, endlessly open world where you're gaming within it, throwing in jurisdiction issues. Because you're not just going to be gaming alone, and you're not just going to be gaming locally, because you don't have to, and why would you? You're not gaming locally now. When you're playing Call of Duty, many of us are playing with people that are countries and continents away. So why would that be any different? Seems fair to assume that it wouldn't be. And jurisdiction is a tangled web. what countries have jurisdiction over what digital qualities and what rules and laws can they impose. So I've just thrown up a couple of recent articles that will start getting your brain twisted on that subject. Excellent paper if you want to write it. So, promised you an introduction to the magic circle. It's a concept coined by Johann Huizinga, who passed away in 1945, who was looking at play. And of course, play and gaming are, as we talked about early in the course, intrinsically related. And that idea was applied to video games by, I hope I have this right, Selin and Zimmerman in 2003 in a piece called Rules of Play, Game Design Fundamentals. The notion is as I've described it, but there's something kind of cool which should resonate with you. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc., are all in form and function playgrounds, i.e. forbidden spots, isolated, hedged round, hallowed within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. So you see, even if you're not a video gamer, by being in law school, you're clearly a gamer. Because law, at least according to this interpretation, is within the magic circle. Hence, rules of procedure. Hence, gowns. Hence, all sorts of things. And just kind of hold that thought metaphorically and put it up against games, and you might find that it starts making sense of at least two parts of your life. So lots of lawyers and legal scholars have looked at this question. This is kind of the core question. Michaela's question, okay, what's the relationship between the real world in terms of law and the magic circle of games in the digital world, and how far and how deeply should real world laws permeate the magic circle? I'm going to take you through briefly, but these are all really serious long pieces, and I would recommend them to you. And you'll see something of a trend, and you'll see realism take over at a certain point. And it starts with Listowka and Hunter, or at least my retelling of it. There's more than just the papers I've given you here. But the original foray, which won't surprise you, gives in strongly to the notion that the digital world is its own world in a separate place. And that's a very, very tempting notion. The advantage we have today is we can start seeing with some degree of clarity what's happening with Ingress and Google Glass and how these things relate to each other and what the future of gaming might look like. But take yourself back to 2003, pre-Wii, all of these various apparitions attached to gaming machines that incorporated real actions into the game. Not completely. There were always certain kinds of controllers for sims, but generally it really felt like a separate world. And so you see this reflected in the academic thought, and these are the academic thoughts essentially of lawyers, except for Castronova, who's an economist, but this was his piece was published in a law journal. And Listoka and Hunter, we have to recognize that these are separate places with a separate community, separate laws, and separate rights. Sometimes the inhabitants of these worlds will come down to our world, to have recourse to our law and gain protections against their gods. So it's a very optimistic place about the separateness of gaming. Now, early on, to his credit, Jack Balkin, who's professor of constitutional law at Yale and the head of the digital center within Yale Law School. I'm sorry, I don't remember its precise name, but it does very good work. Hit the note of reality that we'll come back to. And what he did in his paper, Freedom to Design and Freedom to Play in Virtual Worlds in 2004, is essentially concede that government and real-life laws will have a role to play, and argued very, very strongly that given that, and given that real-world laws will intercede, let's ensure that freedom of speech, freedom of expression is seen as paramount and applied sensitively and properly to protect as much of these worlds, as much of these virtual worlds as possible. Castronova says a legal framework for make-believe places. So again, the assumption, make-believe places will not be very fun to create either, but it will allow everyone, all of us, to spend time in worlds where magic is real. Goodness, we haven't done anything like that in hundreds of years. We miss it. So there's an unbridled optimism, which is very understandable, and which I have considerable sympathy for, personally, that this should be a new and separate world and be beyond laws. Taken up by Joshua Fairfield, again, all legal academics, in a paper called Virtual Property. Cyberspace is neither a bad analogy nor a metaphor. Cyberspace is the descriptive term. In other words, cyberspace is a real place, and it is a separate place. And it should be its own country, and it should have its own flag, and it should have its own laws. Grimmelman in 2006. So now time is sort of marching on, and there's more and more. This was a very hot period for thinking about this subject. Grimmelman, who up until, I guess, the end of this semester is at New York Law School and has just moved, and I don't remember what law school he's moved to. But he's a wonderful thinker. He starts, much as he'd love this to be a separate space, he starts making the concessions. To the extent that the real money trade is a problem, its solution must also recognize the interdependence of the real and the virtual. So that's the big step. The big step is to acknowledge that both the real and the virtual, that the virtual is not a separate place, but it interacts with the real. And then Joshua Fairfield comes back 3 years later and hits on the same sort of note of reality. Players in virtual worlds should understand that their behavior online is not entirely free from real-world scrutiny. This is a bit saddening. So there was a lot of optimism. And now, by 2008, we're actually getting to Jack Balkin's position of 2004.
So I'm curious, if you've got a game like your Street Fighter where you have, the magic circle and you've got basically your characters beating up somebody else's character, now that we're starting into, mobile games or things are actually coming out into the real world, have you come across anybody that's actually arguing, they're fighting somewhere, but they're arguing, no, we're actually just playing something that's actually going on digitally on our mobile devices or something like that?
Well, that is certainly going to be an argument, and your answer is going to come in 2 paragraphs. But before we get there, Mia Consalvo, who is at Concordia in Montreal, is not a lawyer that I know of, but is a games theorist. She wrote a paper in 2009, There is no magic circle. And her argument, like it or not, is there is no innocent gaming. Players also have real lives with real commitments, expectations, hopes, and desires. We can neither ignore such realities nor retreat to structuralist definitions of what makes or defines a game. Games are created through the act of gameplay, which is contingent by acts of players. So because you're real, the game's real. Because you're defined as non-digital, your avatar is imbued with that non-digital, actually human characteristic, and that actually human part is legally circumscribable. Which gets to Benjamin Duransky in a book called Virtual Law, Navigating the Legal Landscape of the Virtual Worlds, published by the American Bar Association. And he goes to the test for the question that you just asked. If a user reasonably understood at the time of acting that the act would have real-world implications, there should be legal consequences.
I'm actually just reading that book now and conveniently have the page tabbed about the magic circle. So, I don't know, Andrew, if you want to or just pass it around. Awesome. It's pretty interesting.
That is awesome. Thank you, Michaela. So, just hold the thought. Real-world play, immersive, anywhere, fully open, literal world with tools and weapons. Is this really a game? And so from there, we start coming to that question. And it almost comes out of left field. But you start wondering whether end-user license agreements and terms of service originally were seen by, I don't know the answer to this question. This would make a fantastic paper, but you'd have to talk to a lot of people. Were seen by developers. And were seen as seen by game creators as a way of insulating against and keeping out real-world laws. As an extension of what Fairfield and others said. This is its own sacred world, so we're going to make our own rules, and the best way of protecting our world is to create those rules, and we'll put them in something that legally our lawyers keep telling us has to be called an end-user license agreement. And you start wondering if these 90-page behemoths actually started in some way as almost constitutional documents designed to protect a certain kind of freedom and designed to protect the magic circle, which is a totally different way of looking at the realities that we explored. And if that was the intention, I'm not saying it was, but if it was, and it kind of resonates that it might have been, maybe the real world and real world lawyers and real world concerns got in the way eventually, and real world opportunities.
The lawyers probably got in the way.
Yeah. But there is an interpretation. So now, the next couple of minutes, I just want to explore which laws. Okay? You got us. There's going to be some real world intervention. So in the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm simply going to do a framework which will take us through right to the end of the course. And this is completely open to suggestion. This is really a first cut. And I call it layers of control. And it's sort of a little bit in reverse order. I just want to go here for a second. I see the bottom layers as the ones that are closest to the game, that are about the game and originality in the game and other issues of gameplay and how things work within the game. Those are the first 6. The final 6 are much more about what's outside the game and cultural factors, community factors, legal factors, normative factors that can affect control, that control or can affect the game, how it's played, where it's played, and what it is. So very quickly, just to take you through them, and I'll take you through them with specific examples. Closest to the game, and again, these can be reordered, and I would love by email or on the blog any suggestions as to proper order, what may be missing here, because no doubt a lot is. Closest to the game, I'd say, is community. If you're going to play, you're playing usually with others in some way. Community, I guess, can be one. There isn't really a legal aspect to that. There's extra legal aspects, so I'll give you examples. Then there's technology, which enables the game, and that's mostly extra legal. Then there's IP, which is definitely legal. Then the next layer, so I just take you up the layers here. The next layer as we go up towards the surface, the outside world, would be EULA's terms of service, which are contractual but private, personality rights, industry self-regulation. Then, and I'll try and illustrate this for you with a specific example, then I think that's where the permeable line goes. See, I really should reverse this and put one on the bottom and the trajectory to the outside world. Then we go to what's outside the game. And then I think you get to medium-specific regulation. We talked about that last week. I'll give you a quick example. Misleading advertising, consumer protection type laws, unfair competition, antitrust laws, the gambling issue that we talked about last week, currency, taxation, and then finally we get the things that are more physical, like theft and assault. Very briefly, let's examine the layers. So on community, extra legal, on the blog, under resources, under copyright, you will find William Fisher's series from Harvard on copyright special events. The third one is called Extra Legal Norms, and it is fascinating because it is about how comedians self-police the theft of jokes and the norms that have arisen, not by dint of intellectual property law, but by dint of community. And without giving it away, you will hear certain comedians, some of whom you will know well, being called out very directly for being joke stealers. And you will learn that there are certain comedians that when they walk into a club, the other comedians refuse to perform. They will not go on stage because they don't want their material stolen.
Somewhat related to that, I have actually I watched some documentary about the problem for comedians now with everyone filming their shows and then it going online, and then they have to always generate new material instead of working on their material throughout their tour. So it's a problem with the internet.
And this hour really explores that question and explores, should there be copyright on jokes, and should comedians sue each other, or do these extra legal normative community functionalities work well enough? Often those involve a fist. So there's lots of questions and problems. But it is a fascinating hour, and that's what I mean by community extra legal. Then we get to technology and tools. We've talked about this one, so it won't take up any time, but Sony patents tech to block used games. So you're not relying on intellectual property law, you're relying on a technological way of enforcing. Then we come to IP, and I won't get into this. We've talked about copyright so much, but I did want to go back to Thomas Macaulay in 1841, the UK House of Commons. Copyright is monopoly. And then a bunch of other pieces. The most fascinating, well, they're all pretty interesting. 3 myths about copyright law and where to start to fix it. What's fascinating about that is that it was a Republican study committee piece that seemed to have gotten suppressed. And you can read about that online. Mark Lemley talking about how IP law has started to become regulatory in nature. Stefan Bechtold talking about how TV show formats don't have almost created an extra legal norm about them, and they're not being enforced through intellectual property law generally, and that's working. And and if you think of all the clones of reality shows, that's what that article gets into. Then had to throw in some of the academic pieces on how musicians' revenues actually can increase when their music is made available free online. And then a piece from Colleen Sheen on or Shen on patent trolls. Keep going with the layers. That's where we arrive at EULAs in terms of service, and you don't want me to talk about that again, so I won't. The next layer as we get to the surface, personality rights. Just a fascinating piece. In Guernsey, they've actually created a new form of IP that, as near as I can tell, doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. They allow the registration of personalities. It's called a registered personality. Go to that piece and learn about it. It's from some lawyers in Guernsey. And by all means, register your personality. Industry self-regulation. You guys know about Grand Theft Auto San Andreas Hot Coffee. Good article to read. The point being industry self-regulation with the ESRB in the United States, which rates games, that's internal to the industry. The out-of-the-game demarcation point is the Canadian example. We talked last week about media-specific regulation. Under the Broadcasting Act, could massively multiplayer gaming be considered broadcasting? Won't get into that again, but I do want to point out that under the broadcasting regime, a version of what you would see as the ESRB on the other side of the line, the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, is an industry organized authority, but it's delegated by the CRTC. So the CRTC, and therefore the government's powers, is delegated into this industry group. So it goes from inside to outside. And it forms the demarcation point. Then we get to squarely the is IP monopoly question. Just want to mention Richard Posner's piece, which I refer you to. Posner is probably the best known for the right reasons American jurist operating today, working today. And some other interesting pieces. Next week, we will talk about advertising, psychological harm, violence, and those kinds of consumer protection and quasi-consumer protection issues. Last week, with Roxanne Christ, we talked about gambling. And now we're getting very close to the surface. And these last two, currency, taxation, you'll see that there's attempts, which don't seem to be going anywhere, to have a tax on violent games in light of recent events, but also the deeper question, the more real question of taxing in-game transactions, especially as games get to that. And I just want to put in a word for Julian Dibble, who is one of video gaming and the digital world's great journalists, and is currently either a second or third year law student at University of Chicago Law School. So after a storied career writing about these issues, he's actually gone back into law school. And it's interesting that he's at these sort of top, I say most difficult issues. He wrote a seminal piece called A Rape in Cyberspace. I think it was 1997. And that's kind of the last layer, which is the theft, assault, criminal law layer. So as I wrap up and make way for Jennifer, here are some things to think about as she goes through her talk. So what's original? And one of the most underrated cases, and maybe just because it seems old, it was just at the very start of my career, but it's seminal and it doesn't seem to be referred to a lot anymore, is Sony.
Oh, I do.
Excellent. Is Sony and Universal. 1984 US Supreme Court. And Jennifer will tell us why she refers to it. But this was the case around of the Sony Betamax. And here we had a new technology. See if this resonates for you. A new technology that changed user experience and threatened traditional intellectual property paradigms. Because it allowed you to tape something, actually physically make a copy. How is that not a copyright infringement? And the US Supreme Court went in what we now broadly call a user rights direction. And my reading of the case, and Jennifer's is probably much better, is that two main factors in finding there wasn't an infringement was the audience actually got bigger. This is kind of interesting because when we talk about the digital world, we're seeing increasing amounts of research that show that the spread of free, in quotes, digital copies actually increases notoriety for the band or the show. Or, I mean, Game of Thrones, there's tons been written around the notion that the, quote, piracy of Game of Thrones has really helped it spread virally. So you got to decide these questions for yourself. But that was one factor in Sony and Universal. And the other was just didn't seem to impair the value of the copyright. So it must be OK. So start applying that to mods, start applying that across the spectrum. What the US Supreme Court called it was time shifting. They said time shifting was OK. I think what we would call it today is context shifting, or shifting the context of the digital bits. These were not digital bits back then. If you want to be really, really cute, and this is only half a joke, you can apply Einstein to it. Since time and space are now known to be one thing, why can't I just move a digital bit from here to there? Then the other thing we've talked about a lot is, as you listen to Jennifer, think about fair dealing, think about users' rights, think about moral rights. Don't exist in the States, do exist in Canada. Are they part of a solution to this? Does attribution and the right of integrity, the right to follow and ensure that your work isn't used in some way that is not offensive, that is not used, to ensure that your work is not used in an offensive way, quite apart from financial remuneration or rights or profits. So in terms of non-economic attribution and integrity rights, how much of the problems of the digital world might that solve? Remember the cult of originalism that we talked about earlier in the course, the personal creation mythology, the Hollywood model. I've thought of a completely original idea. And the notion of, or the question, the really serious academic question as to whether there's even such a thing as an original idea. And then finally, I'll throw into the mix something we've never talked about before, and that is, are we culture bound by this notion of originality? Is this not only our cult, but is it also our culture? And are we exporting to the world a notion of originality that might be a bit aggressive and seen as neo-colonial? And then finally, Jennifer will take you through a whole bunch of cases. I just wanted to throw up, in no particular order, just a whole bunch of interesting articles on the subject of what's original and what isn't, some of which will coincide with what Jennifer has in her presentation, and some of which is just additional cool stuff like infringing World of Warcraft theme park built in China. You know, just a whole bunch of different issues from different angles that might intrigue you or spur your papers on in some way. Next week, finally, we get to the violence issue. And I'm really glad when this course started, we were very close to a tragedy, and I'm very grateful for the time that's passed, because I think it does allow for me to think about it more meaningfully, and hopefully for a more meaningful class for all of us. So without further ado, I'm close. I am going to turn the rest of the class over to the wonderful and amazing Jennifer Kelly.